I have people send me emails or letters in the mail, and they'll say, "You're just jealous because he has such a beautiful wife and he has so much money." Trust me, I'm not the least bit jealous. Donald Trump has never known love, contentment. He will die an empty vessel, trying desperately to fill the emptiness inside from his horrible, unbelievably horrible emotional abuse when he was growing up, with either claims of wealth, although he is now, through extortion as president, a multi-billionaire finally, and claims that he's the great Don Juan of all history and the King Midas. Of course, Trump has no idea that both the stories of both Don Juan and King Midas are tragedies. Midas, everything he touched turned to gold. And what did he touch but his daughter, whom he loved more than anything else? Ghislaine Maxwell, if she were to turn on Trump, would be a real danger. That's why she won't get a pardon. There's no possibility she'll get a pardon. Clemency, yes. Pardon, no. But the documents, you don't need her for that. The documents are in the possession of the Justice Department, which is absolutely free to release these documents. There's nothing preventing the Justice Department from releasing the documents, and the estate. Now, in addition to that, I think there's good reason to believe that other law enforcement agencies have files and records. And that's why it's really important that Congress pursue this. And unfortunately, there are some Republicans who are trying to hold Donald to his promise of releasing this, and they're rather upset about this. And those Republicans who continue to defend Donald on this haven't very carefully thought through what happens if we get irrefutable evidence that Donald Trump is a child rapist, because they're not going to look good at all, and they're going to be very vulnerable to a smart challenger in the next election.
So why do you think Maxwell hasn't been disappeared if she's such a threat to these people?
Because that's not how you do those things. That's Hollywood stuff. Hollywood did a movie starring George Clooney about a lawyer who goes around killing witnesses or having them killed. That's not how that works. In fact, the law school where I taught, they had to have a lecture for every student explaining that's not what you do. You want to bury people in paperwork. You want to do all sorts of other strategies, but you go around killing people. That makes no sense. The stakes are completely out of proportion if you get caught, which you're almost certain to be. So now Epstein's death is another matter. We know from the investigation by Wired magazine and the one by CBS that the tape that was released was crudely edited, apparently 3 to 5 times, depending on which of the sources you go to, and that it was 2 minutes and 57 seconds that are missing. And Maxwell did say in the 6 hours with Todd Blanche that she doesn't believe he committed suicide. Other events going on suggest that he didn't commit suicide. He set up a financial entity 2 days before this, and his ego was so huge. People with egos like that don't tend to kill themselves unless they have some seemingly noble reason. There's very good reason to think that Ken Lay, who ran Enron, induced his own heart attack that killed him, which prevented making his conviction stand because he hadn't been sentenced, and saved his family financially. If that's what happened, it makes sense. I can see that. But nothing about Epstein. He doesn't have a family to protect. He's just him. And getting to the truth about what happened there should be one of the principal goals if we get Democratic majority in the House, the Senate, or both, starting in January of 27.
Enron, the biggest financial contributors to the Bush crime family at one point in time. So, you touched on Wexner, etc. Do you think in the Epstein case, anyone will ever be held to account that was more powerful than Epstein, Wexner's, the Blacks of the world?
Now, let me be clear. Les Wexner, who said almost nothing about this, says, I never did anything wrong whatsoever. We need to be clear about that. The only way there will be accountability is either the Democrats get a majority in the House of the Senate and therefore can conduct investigations, and they will. They are very clear about that. They will do that if they get majorities, which is why Trump is trying so hard to get districts redrawn, to stop mail-in voting, to do anything he can to protect his position. And secondly, there may be somewhere a state investigation that can be undertaken. I'm surprised that Alvin Bragg, who has evidence that Donald Trump is a serial felonious tax cheat, has not gone back and prosecuted him again. But, he's a politician. Like all politicians, they wake up in the morning, wet their finger, and see which way the wind is blowing. And while the wind is blowing against Donald, especially in Manhattan, there are also risks. And you can be seen as overreaching. But I think there's a very good chance that that will happen. The thing we have to worry about is that Donald declared himself to be America's dictator on February 26th, just 5 weeks into his term. He put out a statement, a quote wrongly attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte and others. He who saves his nation violates no law. 3 days later, the White House posted at 3 different websites, social media sites, an AI image of Donald in a royal British crown. If there's anything that is blasphemy in our secular country, it's that. And of course, Donald has run all these ads and promos about him being president forever in the future. He has said, you won't need to hold the elections if you just get me back in office in 24. Donald is perfectly capable, if he can get the military behind him, to seize full power. What he's doing right now, Sean, is consolidating his power. He's eliminated inspectors general, most of them, not all of them, but all ones that were a threat to him or Elon Musk. He has complete control of the Justice Department, which is now his personal law firm for retribution and defense for himself. He has put utterly incompetent people in charge of our national security, defense, and health and human services. So Donald, because he has no moral core of any kind, is perfectly capable of taking really severe action. And I believe that the use of troops on the streets in LA and Washington, and they are doing preparation to go into Boston and to Chicago. All, by the way, cities with people of color as mayors, and Democratic cities, because almost all cities of any size are Democratic in this country. Those are just test runs to see what he can do. If you're listening to this and you are in the military, I'd point out to you something very important. The Nuremberg trials. You can't say I was just following orders. If you are a sailor or an airman or a grunt in the Army, you take an oath to follow the orders of the president and to support the Constitution. You do not take an oath to follow orders that are illegal. But if you are an officer in the U.S. military or an officer in any capacity in the United States, you only take an oath to uphold the Constitution. It is your duty to not carry out wrongful orders. And I would argue it is your duty to make a clear record, if necessary, a loud public record, to anybody under your command, whether you're military command or civilian, that these things would be illegal. And those people who violate that, if we have a change in administration, if we get out of this and our democracy endures, they should expect that they will be prosecuted and they will go to prison, or if they're in the military, the brig. The most important things going on right now, Sean, are coming up with new information, new revelations to keep the Epstein story alive. That was critical in Watergate. The LA Times, where I worked later, broke many of the biggest Watergate stories that people wrongly think the Washington Post broke. The Washington Post did great work, but the LA Times did extraordinary work all the way through as well. And a lot of Washington Post stories were leveraged off of LA Times stories. We need to have enough organizations digging into what's going on here. And we need less of the unthinking coverage that we saw when Rybolovlev got Donald Trump out of his useless mansion property and got him the $40 million he needed to pay the bank loan that was coming due. Much more skeptical thinking about this, and news organizations to back up their staffs.
So why have the banks paid such astronomical sums to Epstein survivors? I mean, what's the role of the banks in this? Hundreds of millions.
Yeah. Well, because the clearly what's in the files that we have not all seen, that are the civil files, show the banks were complicit. Banks in the U.S., whether federally chartered or state, and all of the banks that I'm aware of in the Epstein case are federally chartered, are subject to lots of rules and regulation. I used to teach regulation from the ancient world. How did we get regulation today? Started 4,000 years ago. And bankers who facilitated criminal conduct, bankers who did not follow the requirements to know your customer, they are vulnerable. And the banks are very tough on this on ordinary issues. My wife and I used to have an overdraft account in case we screwed up our checking account. And my wife didn't put her version of the document for our joint account in the mail. And we were barred from not only from that account, but we were told we can never have it again. Kind of annoying because the rules can be very harsh. And that's a simple legal algebra. Once presented with the evidence of their complicity and their see no evil approach to the Epstein matter, lawyers told the bank executives, if we go to trial with these very sympathetic defendants, rape victims in some cases, then our exposure would be not the hundreds of millions we've paid, but billions of dollars. It's just a financial decision. That's how most settlements are. And unfortunately, we allow settlements to be sealed even when they are over things like pharmaceuticals that turned out not, have problems that weren't caught during development, which means other people get sick or die. I have a real problem with that. The Seattle Times did a big investigation of this 25 years ago, documenting harms done by allowing sealing of these cases. But if I were the bankers in the current environment, and if I were a lawyer, not just a law professor, I would certainly have told my client, look, you can settle this for $300 million, or you can risk going in front of a jury that'll give you 5% of the net worth of the bank to the rape victims. Because you're not going to be successful in keeping out that they contend that they were raped. And by the way, what about the discovery in that? What if anybody in the bank had some relationship we don't know about with Epstein or one of his cohort? Because you're not dealing with Epstein as a unique entity here. There's the other people in the modeling business. There are other people around him. And this goes to the desperate need in this country to get serious about white-collar crime.
So you've got a few viewer questions have come in. One's from Philip. What is the reason Deutsche Bank came to Trump's rescue in the 1990s and 2000s?
David Enrich, E-N-R-I-C-H, who's the deputy investigations editor at the New York Times, wrote a very good book about this that I recommend to you. He's an extraordinarily good reporter. His father was a law professor at Northeastern. I don't have proof of what I'm going to tell you, but I know how banking practices work. Imagine, Sean, your children want to start a business and they want, Dad, would you loan us $1 million? Here's our business plan. And you say to yourself, yeah, it looks like a pretty good business plan. It might fail, but I don't want to have the difficulties of collecting from my children if they flake out or their business fails. So you go down to your banker and you say, listen, make the $1 million loan to my kids. It's a judgment loan, but I will deposit with you a letter of credit for $1 million. And if they flake out, you can draw the letter of credit. The bank will be made whole. It's a risk-free loan because you've got $1 million to back the $1 million. These are known as back-to-back transactions. There is a distinct possibility that someone, maybe a Russian oligarch, maybe a front for the Russian oligarchs, set up such an arrangement. Go ahead and loan the money to Donald, and we'll make sure he's covered. Now, the head of Deutsche Bank, Joseph Ackerman, when he was forced out because of all of the Deutsche Bank scandals, what happened to him? he went to become chairman of the Bank of Cyprus, an island with a very large Russian expatriate community. The Bank of Cyprus, after the Deutsche Bank, was probably the most notorious Russian money laundering bank in the world. One of the two co-chairmen of that bank was effectively appointed by Vladimir Putin. Who was the other co-chairman appointed by? Donald Trump's first commerce secretary. So there's this enormous interconnections that go on. And, you know, even for me, it's incredibly difficult to follow all of this. By the way, somebody I noticed going by in the comments referred to me as Dr. Johnston. I'm not. I do not have a doctorate. I studied at the doctoral level, but I don't even have a college degree because I went to college for 8 years, earned enough credits for probably 2 master's degrees, but was denied a degree because I walked into college as a junior. I skipped freshman and sophomore years because I'd learned all that stuff on my own. I taught it to myself. And, you know, why would I take a basic writing course? I was 17 years old. I was making my living writing and supporting my wife. At 17, I was married and I had a kid on the way, and I supported myself with my writing. I have an extraordinarily good education, but the only thing I have is a Knight High School diploma.
So Ocean wants to know, what proof do you have of these serious allegations you've made against Trump and kids, teenagers?
So we, as I very clearly said, and I hope people heard, we do not have any absolute irrefutable evidence. And Donald Trump says it's a hoax now. He used to say other things. Right now he's calling it a hoax. But we do have an enormous amount that I've been talking about in this interview of smoke suggesting there's a fire here. The 12 children as young as 12 who were gambling in Donald's casinos. That's a proven fact. There were hearings before the Casino Control Commission. If you get my book, which you can buy for $1 or $2 now because it's 32 years old on the internet, Temples of Chance. That's what I call casinos, because it's, to many gamblers, a religious experience. Temples of Chance. You can read the names of these children and how one of them, the father, was a police detective who tried to get the casinos to stop letting his 13-year-old daughter gamble. And he was just basically laughed at by in his face. We have Donald's comments on the Howard Stern show, where he's asked, you know, well, how young is too young? And he goes, well, 12 years old. There are Jeffrey Epstein's statements to him. There are numerous photographs and video clips of Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein together. And there's no question that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were recruiting and raping underage girls. Court files suggest there were 1,000 girls, underage girls, 1,000 of them, who were procured and raped. And why did that happen? Well, you know, you have lots of young people who grow up in dysfunctional homes. Maybe they're victims of incest already. They've had been thrown out of the house for some reason. Whatever the problem is, it's not hard to find teenage girls and boys who are vulnerable and get picked up. When my oldest daughter was 12, I had her come from our home in Santa Cruz to my office at the LA Times in San Francisco on the bus as part of a growing up experience. When she got off the bus in San Francisco and was walking up Market Street, she was immediately met by guys known as chicken hawks who want to turn her into a prostitute. And good for her, you know, she said, "Get away from me," to these guys, and went forward. But, you know, don't be naive about the nature of exploitation of children in this country. We have Donald Trump's promise to make all this stuff public, and then it's a hoax. Well, I'm sorry. Why would you do that? After 1,000 Department of Justice employees, that's the government statement, not mine, 1,000 DOJ employees, many of them FBI agents, were assigned to go through the Epstein files and find references to Trump. Suddenly it's, no, there's nothing there, nothing to see, folks, nothing there. What that says, I think, to anybody who's not naive is there's a lot there to be seen, a lot. And that's why they're trying to change the tune, and they're in complete control of the information as of the moment. So there's lots of other stuff, Sean, that's out there. I mean, I think it's a reasonable question. And the caller or the poster presumably didn't listen to the beginning of this conversation.
What year was the Howard Stern
I don't remember the year, but it's easy to find on the internet. And there are people now who are posting these things. What I wish somebody would do who has the skill I don't is build a video timeline of all of these things with verified clips and photos. You have to be very careful on the internet these days because of AI and other manipulative tools that can lie to you. But there's lots of reliable, verifiable public record. When I teach journalists, the thing I principally teach my students is your job is to not hear some facts, but to then cross-check them, and then cross-check them, and then cross-check them, and then cross-check them until you've done two things. You know where it belongs in the universe, because you don't want to take some little issue and make it sound like World War III, and that you have bolted down the facts so that nobody can dispute that you've given a rounded version to everybody of what is known in the record. And then you, of course, have to attribute all of that to verifiable sources.
So I agree with you that, some of these things that you've said are absolutely disgusting and despicable. But do you think a shift in moral relativism has played a role in this? So, for example, I lived in America for 16, 17 years. I used to listen to some Howard Stern, and they just would say the most disgusting, shocking things to get a reaction out of people. And also in my own country, before I left my own country, one of the biggest TV shows here was Benny Hill, which started out with dirty old men chasing young women through a field in stockings and suspenders and pinching their behinds. And that was one of the most popular championed bloody TV shows over here back then. So do you think that morals have changed, and you've got to put things in the context of the morals of I'm not trying to, justify anything that's been said, but
I think that the changes that have taken place in America since World War II have had lots of pluses and lots of minuses. There's an old saying that I teach, and that is every solution creates a new problem. And from teaching young people since 2009, I can tell you that many of them had no moral training growing up whatsoever. The number of children who go to Sunday school or catechism or shul is way down. And we're not doing a good job of teaching the sanctity of human life and other values. And on the other hand, at least for the moment, we live in a society where people of color aren't told this is your place and you better do what we say or we'll come after you. Women are no longer chattel property to their husbands. But the moral breakdown that I've written the most about in my best-selling books is at the very top in this country. The emergence of the tax shelters that I exposed, these absolutely fraudulent tax avoidance devices, which technically anybody could use, but the cost of them means if you can't afford $1 million for the fees because you're trying to save $1 billion, then you're not going to do it. And I've quoted leading people in both accounting and law as saying there's been a serious moral breakdown at the top in this country. That's where the moral breakdown bothers me. There's member of Congress after member of Congress, including some Republicans no longer in office, who have all said that in private, large numbers of Republican senators and representatives will say, yeah, I know Donald Trump is a criminal. I know that he's a disaster. I know he doesn't know anything. I know he's doing bad things to the country. But if I speak up, I'll lose in the primary. He'll run somebody against me in the Republican primary. And we've seen that happen repeatedly. That's an example of a lack of moral courage. More than 1 million people died for this country, for this idea of the United States. What happens if we throw off a king and we decide to govern ourselves? Will that ennoble the human spirit and allow us to make great achievements if we do that? And if you are unwilling to risk your seat in Congress or the Senate because of Donald Trump says he'll run somebody against you, I think those 1 million people and a much larger group that includes my father, a 100% disabled veteran of World War II, you're dishonoring those people. You know, I don't know if you've seen the memes of all of the photos people have put up of troops landing on Omaha Beach or Gold Beach during the Normandy invasion. You know, it's Antifa pursuing Nazis. But clearly, there's a problem with moral education in America. I would not dispute that in the least, particularly as a father of 8, where I've gotten to see through my children's friends and things, lots of issues. I worry less about the sex part of this, even with Jeffrey Epstein, than I do about the financial degradation. Little fact I revealed years ago. Every year for 30 years, I've done a big analysis of the 3 major sources of income data in the US. And one of those is actual wages and salaries. 2016, when Trump lost the election but won the Electoral College, the bottom 90% of Americans, adjusted for inflation, made 8.5% less income than they did in 1973. In other words, they only got paid through November. They had to go the whole month of December, in essence, with no income compared to their parents or grandparents in 1973. Now, in 1973, if you had a pension, about 45% of workers, or health care, more than half of workers, that was on top of your salary, on top of your wages. It was a fringe benefit. Now those things come in large part out of your paycheck. So when you adjust for that in 2016, people only got paid through the end of October. They went 2 months, 2 whole months, with no income. No wonder people are living in economic fear and terror. And on the other hand, an explosion of billionaires, centimillionaires, and they're everywhere. People with this unbelievable riches, far beyond any possible useful consumption of that money. I mean, frankly, I used to do a game with my graduate business students about trying to, how much money can you spend if you have unlimited money to spend, but you have to work 50 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. Almost nobody could spend over $800,000 a year in consumption. The champion was my skinflint wife, who was CEO of a charity for 30 years. She managed to get it up to $5 million because she got the conceit. You don't buy a jet, you lease one and have it ready to go. You know, you hire a limo service so that there's a car ready to go sitting in the driveway 24 hours a day. Then you can run up the bills. But this worshiping of people at the top, the poor voting to borrow money to give tax cuts to billionaires. That's what we're doing in America under Donald Trump. We are borrowing money, adding to the national debt so that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Larry Ellison and Bill Gates can pay less in taxes. And Bill Gates, in fact, has said, if we had a proper tax system, my fortune would be 1/3 the size it is. Yeah.
And Joyce wants to know if we can ever force these people to pay taxes equivalent to their earnings.
Any day of the week. My next book, the one I stopped working on 10 years ago because Donald announced and dropped it, I'm now back trying to finish, is a proposal for an entirely new federal tax system, which would work in any other developed country. It'll work in the UK, Germany, Australia. It's been gone over by a lot of experts, including tax administrators, very important people for a tax system, tax accountants, tax lawyers, business owners, and they all essentially say the same thing. They pick little pieces of lint off it or disagreements about it, but they all come back and say, this would really work. It would make the country wealthier by far. It would promote social stability, and it will never happen because the people who've learned how to turn the burden of the income tax into a profit center won't allow it. By the way, when I broke the story about that in, I guess it was 2002, that a lot of companies had figured out how to turn the corporate income tax into a profit center, New York Times was deluged with calls and complaints and, who is this crazy person? You don't make money off taxes. Congress undertook the biggest study ever done by the Joint Committee on Taxation, 1,800-page, 3-volume study that showed not only was I exactly right, but at Enron, they put a rubber stamp on some documents in the tax department that said profit center. And by the way, I see you've got Paula up here. Again, Paula, I'm not doctor, okay? I'm not doctor. How do I
Have you
feel
ever
about
felt in danger doing your
Not
research?
about any of this. When I wrote about the LAPD, I was the first journalist to seriously investigate them when I was at the LA Times, which ruined my career there because the editors didn't want to go where I went. They had a worldwide spying operation. They had undercover officers in Moscow and Havana. There were undercover officers committing all sorts of crimes. The police chief assigned officers to sleep with women. The classic spy technique to get information, whether you're a male or female spy. Between the sheets, people tell you what you need to know. I was literally asked to go meet in an out-of-the-way place by a senior officer who thought my life was in danger. And I told him, well, I've got to do what I've got to do. But I immediately went and sat down and wrote a 31-page memo and put copies with 5 different people with instruction that if anything did happen to me, they were to release this. And nothing happened. But that and a couple of, I once personally, I've solved several murder cases and a lot of other crimes. And I personally hunted down a rather vicious black on white killer once. And when I asked him about why he committed the crime, he said he needed to get something in his bedroom. And he got up, and I decided to follow him because I figured it was probably a large gun. And he'd been in the joint, so he had big muscles, and he was bigger than I am. But he just wanted to show me a photograph. He was basically a pussycat in a lot of ways. And this resulted, by the way, at the end of the day, in a young man who had been tried 4 times for the murder without a resolution. There was a 5th trial. My evidence was introduced by the defense. The jury acquitted the young man, and the real killer was called as a witness, but he can never be prosecuted because all the witnesses in the first 5 trials got up and said, yeah, it's this guy at the defense table, when it was the other guy. Those are the only times I particularly felt in danger.
Question from Anisha. Yeah. Do you think the Democrats would release the files if it means exposing the Clintons' corruption?
Yeah. If Bill Clinton is a child rapist, the Democrats are going to release those files. Clinton says, and I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary, that, well, he knew Epstein. He never went to, and he flew in his plane. He never went to his island. Bill Clinton is a well-known horn dog. The movie Anonymous, goes into this in some detail with Allison Janney as the model person for this. But I haven't seen any evidence of Bill Clinton and underage girls. And that's the issue here. It's not sex with people who've reached the age of consent. It's underage girls. Or it may be that some of Epstein's clients were into underage prepubescent boys.
Do you think that the Clinton Foundation is structured to minimize paying taxes, etc.?
Well, the Clinton Foundation is exempt from taxes. It's a foundation. But here's something very few people know. When there were all these accusations that the Clinton Foundation was doing corrupt and dishonest things, against the advice of counsel, the Clinton Foundation ordered an audit of every single invoice and check, every transaction. Usually the way accountants do an audit is they'll go through and we're going to take the 111th document in a file and then the next 111th document. That is, you sample. There are a variety of techniques for sampling. But they said, no, we're going to pay to have every single transaction reviewed. And they made the report public. And what the report shows is the kind of minor things you would have in your checkbook. Like I noticed the other day in my check register that I had entered something as a gift to one of my male children, and it wasn't. It was to his twin sister. And so that's the kind of absolutely minor, insignificant things that were found. So there's no evidence of that whatsoever. Now, did the Clintons use the foundation to enhance their position around the world? Of course they did. Of course they did. There's nothing wrong with that.
So Dawn wants to know, will other islands be investigated like Epstein's? I know we had the other guy, what was his name? The other billionaire out of Canada who
also on an island and did this kind of stuff. I don't know anything about that story, to be clear. But there's sex trafficking of minors all over the world. There are governments, basically monarchical governments, that we know are heavily involved in doing this. And so if you're the US State Department, you may well know that there's a bunch of girls from country X who are being trafficked in country Y. Then you have to look at, well, what are the national security and diplomatic interests of the United States? And how do you weigh the criminal conduct involving these children, which, by the way, may not be a crime in that country, against other interests? And that's the reason that the world is such a difficult and complex place. I do think that if we are successful in reviving our democracy and we get Trump out, that is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter. We know now that large parts of our Constitution's rules to ensure proper behavior are unenforceable. Donald Trump is now flagrantly violating the Emoluments Clause, and he violated it throughout his first term. What happened when he was taken to court? The courts said, you have no standing. You have no legal right to bring a case, so it didn't get heard. I am in this class of people who believe that Donald Trump is ineligible to hold office because Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that no one may hold any office of public trust in the United States, not just federal government, anything, state or local government, if they gave aid or comfort to an insurrection. Well, Donald Trump clearly gave aid and comfort to the January 6th insurrection. I don't think any federal judge will hear that case. They'll argue, who are you to bring this case? It's like if something's wrong in the tax law, you can't go to court. The court will say, that's not your purview. That's the purview of Congress. And having impeachment as the only solution for wrongful acts, criminal acts by a president doesn't work. So we need to go in and strengthen provisions of our Constitution. Sean, two things about this. One of the reasons that we don't have these enforcement provisions is that the framers, we don't have a great deal of record on them, but we have some. The framers never thought that an utterly corrupt person like Donald Trump would try and turn the federal government into a criminal organization. It didn't occur to them. They assumed honorable people. They recognized individual venality. And there's a very good book about this by Zephyr Teachout called Corruption in America. The Constitution was concerned with structural corruption. The problem is they didn't provide a means for enforcement when there's structural corruption. The other thing people should know is, the Nazis called their regime the Third Reich. The French say they live in the Fifth Republic. Do you know what republic we live in the United States, Sean? Nobody does. We live in the Second American Republic. The first republic was the Articles of Confederation. It failed after 7 years. Why did it fail? Because it had no power to tax. It was government by birthday cake fundraiser, and it had no power to regulate commerce. So we had trade wars going on between New York and Connecticut and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And so a meeting was called to discuss what to do about how sandbars had moved in the Delaware River and the dispute that couldn't be resolved between Pennsylvania and Maryland and New Jersey over this, and it turned into the Constitutional Convention. The purpose of the Constitutional Convention became so that we could tax ourselves, something we don't teach at all, just as we teach that the Boston Tea Party was a protest against high taxes. No, it was the opposite. It was a protest against a tax exemption for the friends of the king. And so we could regulate commerce. And Americans don't know their own damn history, even though it's all written down. It's not like you have to know some magical holy of holies secret. It's right there, but we don't teach that. People don't know that. I mean, tax is, when I was the tax reporter at the New York Times, I used to say tax is the most vile four-letter word in America. And of course, it's 3 letters. That was part of the joke. But the whole reason we live under the Constitution is so we could be taxed. But that's not what we teach. That's not what we tell people. We tell these myths and lies. And it's like the textbooks, that imply that the slaves who came from Africa were coming in search of a better life and to work and improve their morals and, just absolute crazy nonsense history. So anybody else? Because we're sort of at the...
Deborah wants to know if you could elaborate on the banker who died in Florida who was linked to Trump.
I'm not sure. It doesn't ring a bell with me. I'm sorry. But as a general rule, as I mentioned in referring to the George Clooney movie, Michael something, you don't go around killing people over civil cases. That's not what happens. And occasionally something happens. Barry Seal got assassinated over his knowledge of the U.S. government's role in drug trafficking in Central America. But that's if you avoid conspiracy, and I say this as somebody who's literally broken up conspiracies in my career, most what people think are conspiracies really aren't.
Yeah, I've written a book about Barry Seal called American Made. That was interesting. Iran-Contra, Oliver North, Felix Rodriguez, the Bush, yeah, all that stuff. But anyway, you have been an absolute gentleman. You've been so generous with your time. Absolutely fascinating. Lots of food for thought here. Is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion to the viewers? And I've got all your links down there as well. Keep
pressing your members of Congress, regardless of the party they're in. You want the Epstein files. If they hold a town hall, absolutely press that, because we cannot have a child rapist in the White House, and we need to know either he is or he is not a child rapist. You know, just as Richard Nixon said, "I am not a crook," and we now know that in fact he was a felon. He just was never indicted. He got a pardon. And if you doubt that, I'll point out to you, his tax advisor went to prison for the tax crimes committed by Richard Nixon. We need to know, is the president of the United States a child rapist, and much worse, a frequent serial child rapist? So you got to find ways to keep that alive, to demand that your authorities, your member of Congress who works for you, your senator who works for you, get pressed on this. And similarly, you know, very concise letters to your local newspaper or TV station saying, why aren't you telling us more about Epstein? This is an absolute important issue. Keep the heat up on this particular issue.
Well said. Like I said, all of the links are in the description box if you're watching this on replay. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you,
hope
Sean.
you have a great rest of your weekend. And I'll let you go and close the show. Cheers.
Thank you, Sean. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye. All right, folks. Thank you for all your questions. And like I said, the professor's links, I'll put them in the live chat again right now. He's on Twitter, website, book, etc. And I think we're back. Lauren's back tomorrow. I think she's got a 2-hour show coming around 6 or 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. I've been on the road for a couple of days. It's been Ziggy's 2nd birthday. Here he is. Here he is. He's just come running in. Whoa! Ziggy is no longer a baby. He's a toddler. He's a toddler. You're not a little baby anymore, Ziggy. What's this, Mummy?
His phone.
This is he's got a phone now, folks. Is that your phone? Does it make noises?
Press the middle
Does it
button.
make noises? Wow, is that cool? That's cool.
Okay.
Is that cool, Ziggy? Oh, everybody's saying happy birthday, Ziggy. Oh, thank you, guys. Appreciate that. Yeah, so we've been up in the Northwest celebrating Ziggy's birthday, which is the same day as my dad's birthday. My dad was 77 and Ziggy's 2. But anyway, look out for Lauren tomorrow. I'm going to catch up on everything. I'll be back soon as well. But look out for Lauren tomorrow evening. I think she's got a 2-hour show planned. And thank you for all the birthday wishes. Take care, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Much love. See you in the next